for Hostages and Missing Persons, Gal Hirsch, has reportedly proposed offering Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar safe passage out of Gaza in exchange for all 101 hostages that remain in captivity, now held for nearly a year. The information revealed in a Bloomberg interview with the disclaimer that it's not clear if Hamas has responded or would even consider it at all. This comes as ceasefire negotiations resume between Israel and Hamas, kind of going back and forth between Doha and Cairo. The war, as I mentioned, nearing the 1-year mark. A lot of developments to discuss here, so I want to bring in Enia Krivine, the Senior Director of the Israel Program and the National Security Network at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me again, Josh.
All right. Well, first off, I do want to ask you here about that information coming in regarding the negotiator. Is that something that Israel would really consider doing and Hamas would accept?
Sure. So Gal Hirsch has done a pretty good job of staying out of the limelight as Israel's top negotiator for hostages. So I do think that it's significant that he's gone on the air a couple times recently, once in Hebrew and now this Bloomberg interview, and let some details about the negotiations out. I think it's really significant because there's been a push or a campaign to paint this as Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, as being the roadblock to getting some kind of deal. And I think it's significant that finally Gal Hirsch and others are breaking their silence and showing the public just how far Israel is willing to go and what big concessions that it has put on the table in order to try to get these hostages back. So this is just one of them. You know, Israel has done an incredible job militarily against Hamas. It has destroyed the backbone of this military. It's killed over 17,000 operatives, according to the IDF. So the Hamas remains a shell of what it was before. Of course, Israel can't go after every terrorist, every gun, every tunnel. That will never happen. But it has largely been destroyed as a military force. And that was one of Israel's top goals of the war. The other was to make sure that Gaza couldn't be a platform from which to attack Israel again. And I believe that that has largely been attained. So the last, and for many, many people in Israel, the most important thing, war goal that Israel has yet to achieve is to bring the hostages home. And I believe that Israel is willing to make very painful concessions in order to get that.
And I did want to discuss all of this a little bit further. You kind of touched on this, but the Israel Defense Forces has initially said, of course, that the Khan Yunis ex-commander there was actually begging Sinwar and his brother for help as that brigade was falling apart. And now we've learned over the past several days from the IDF that the Rafah brigade has now been destroyed, so to speak. So how significant is that overall when you look at the big picture?
In the battle against Hamas, it's very significant. Look, the Rafah brigade was the last intact, standing major unit of Hamas. When Israel decided to go into Rafah a couple months ago, it made it clear that it had to go in to destroy this last sort of unit, this brigade, battalion. But there's another really important reason that Israel had to go into Rafah, and that was to close off the smuggling routes through which Hamas was arming itself, bringing munitions and people in and out of the Gaza Strip over the years. And so it was a critical strategic win for Israel to be able to go in, close in those smuggling routes, essentially depriving Hamas of the oxygen it needs to continue the war and destroy that brigade. So, but I don't want to lose sight of the big picture here, Josh. I mean, the battle with Hamas looks like it's nearing an end. The IDF has achieved its military goals, but of course, this war is a larger war between Israel and the Iranian axis, and we've seen it attacked on 7 fronts. Just in the past few days, Israel's had terror attacks from Jordan, the West Bank. It's had rockets from Gaza. It's had escalation of rockets from the north. So while the battle against Hamas may be over, there is a long war ahead.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about the situation over in the north in just a second, but I wanted to ask you about a report from Hebrew media now saying that some of Hamas's warehouses are overflowing with that humanitarian aid that's been stolen that was supposed to be going into the civilians there in Gaza, but Hamas has taken so much of it that it's now stacked up in those warehouses and there's no room for it. What do you make of that? Because it almost seems to provide more evidence of what the IDF has been saying all along, which is that the aid is flowing in. However, it's not making it to the civilians.
That's correct, Josh. Israel has said since early on in the war that there is no limit to the aid that will go into that they will allow into Gaza. And indeed, they've opened up additional points so that the international community can get aid into the enclave. But the issue, as we've talked about before, has always been getting the aid to the people who need it. And Hamas has been hoarding that aid and selling it on the black market. And there was a report earlier in the week that estimates that Hamas has made $500 million off of the black market in aid. Now, that's just an estimate in Israeli media, but I don't think that it's unlikely. And here's why. Because Hamas knows how to smuggle and it knows how to use the black market. All of these tunnels that came through from Egypt to Gaza that we talked about just a second ago, they brought in munitions, they brought in weapons and rockets and drones and other military goods, but they also just brought in everyday things that Hamas then resold on the black market. And a big part of its income was that markup that it made in order to sell everyday goods. Think perfumes or food or other goods that came in that were smuggled under the ground there from Egypt. So now that this lifeline has been cut off along the Philadelphia corridor, that humanitarian aid, however much they've managed to hoard in their warehouses, is their new financial lifeline. And we can thank the international community, U.S. tax dollars for now keeping that terrorist group financed.
The iPhone 16 is here, and this is a mouse case.
And as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit more about the North because you were just there and we have some photos. But before we do that, I do have one more question that comes to mind. We know that the Israel Defense Forces saying that they stopped 2 Israeli civilians from crossing over into Gaza from Israel. Is that something that can be done? And just excuse my ignorance there because I'm not really sure. I haven't been to that location, but I wanted to get your take on that and whether it's actually possible to travel from Israel into Gaza right now, which is, of course, an active war zone.
So it hasn't been easy, we'll put it that way, to get from Israel into Gaza for many, many years. Israel's had a military blockade on Gaza since Gaza started attacking Israel with rockets and mortars and missiles very soon after Israel disengaged from that territory. So it's not a porous border. However, there have been instances before the war when people have managed to get through to Gaza. In fact, one of the hostages of there's 103 left. 4 of them predate the war, and one of them was an Israeli Arab who ostensibly went into Gaza thinking that he could join Hamas. So there's a lot of different reasons for going into Gaza, but since the war began, first to your question, can they get in? It looks like a couple of people have managed to broach the interior boundary on the Israeli side. So Israel has its own little buffer zone on Israeli territory, and it looks like some folks have managed to get past the first barrier, but then have been stopped before they got into Gaza. And that's what it looks like happened with these 2 just yesterday. And then there are a couple of reasons they could have been going. I don't like to speculate because you never know. People do the strangest things all the time. But a couple of folks have approached the border throughout the war who have been advocating for resettling Gaza. Again, this would just be some sort of publicity stunt. Families of hostages have also approached the border, again, just to gain publicity and visibility for their cause. And then there's always the chance that it could have been a Hamas sympathizer, but we just don't have information. Like I said, they only breached that internal Israeli buffer zone, and they weren't successful in going in.
And I want to show those photos that we were talking about right here just moments ago. These, of course, sent to us by you as you were there. Just explain to me what you saw while you were there, because we know that the Hezbollah attacks on Israel in the north have been going on for a while. And as a result, we have seen fires that are essentially burning out of control. And you see it in one of the photos and the video here.
Yeah, so I took a road trip up north with a couple of journalist friends on Thursday, and while we were there, we met with the heads of security in the Galilee region. And of course, many of your viewers may know the Galilee region because it's, of course, where Jesus walked and where a lot of Jesus's miracles were performed. So the Galilee region is in the north of Israel. There's about 1.5 million people, Jews, Druze, Arabs and Christians who all coexist, and other minorities, but those are the large communities that all coexist in the Galilee. And if you go into the northern part of the Galilee, where you get close to the Lebanese border, there's a zone that's evacuated. And I went with my colleagues and we drove up north to the evacuated zone and visited the largest evacuated city up there. And this is where some of the pictures of the damage are from. This is a city of 25,000 that's been evacuated for almost a year. And that picture there is of a kindergarten. And you can see that there was an impact from a rocket on the kindergarten, and the concrete wall behind it is sprayed with shrapnel. And you can only imagine what that would look like if that kindergarten had been in session on that day. Of course, this is an evacuated town. It's receiving a lot of fire. The security head told me that that town alone, that evacuated town of Kiryat Shmone, in the finger of the Galilee, in the very northern part of Israel, it's a lush valley surrounded on three sides by Lebanese territory. Kiryat Shmone, since the war started, has absorbed over 700 direct hits to infrastructure. So you can understand when you see these kind of images why it was necessary to evacuate that town. However, walking into it, it turned into a ghost town. There's no people, there's no cars. The traffic lights kind of blink intermittently. It's spooky, and it's definitely an unsustainable situation for Israel's north. About 60,000 people live in communities like Kiryat Shmone that have been completely evacuated. But there's another 1 million people that live in the north who are all in range of these Hezbollah rockets, and who are all living on a knife's edge. You know, they send their kids to school, they hear of an evacuation, they're terrified that their children may have been involved, they don't want their kids to go home on the school bus, and they're living with this kind of fear for almost a year now. So that's the north, and that's the view from the Galilee. I'm glad to share it with you, Josh.
All right. Enia, thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to join us and break it all down, and also share those photos of your trip there to the north. Is there anything else that you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
No, I mean, you and I, Josh, we're always watching the West Bank, and it's been a pretty busy week there with a lot of activity from the IDF. They just discovered another tunnel yesterday. This is clearly a goal of the terrorists in the West Bank, is to have their own tunneling program like Hamas and Hezbollah. So we're all watching it very closely and hoping that things start to calm down there, although unfortunately trajectory seems to be going in the opposite direction.
All right.